warm welcome to everyone joining this webinar today. It's not so sunny here in Richmond, BC, but I hope the weather is a lot better where you are, and I know you're coming in from all over the place. The first thing that we do is we acknowledge the traditional lands that we live and work on, and Royal Roads University acknowledges that we live, learn, and work on the traditional lands of the Esquimalt and the Songhees families. I want to say a few words about the School of Humanitarian Studies. You can see on the screen that we have various different programs ranging from a Master of Arts in Conflict Analysis and Management to a Master of Arts in Disaster and Emergency Management, to a Master of Arts in Human Security and Peace Building. And as a program head for Human Security and Peace Building, of course, we're quite keen to talk about these different topics, and we have been running a series of webinars. We've already run 2 webinars on the Kurdish population in Rojava, for instance, and we'll be doing more webinars as they come up in the next few months. But today we're going to concentrate on political economy analysis and some very exciting new thinking that Alexander Reardon has been working with, and Mark Cassidy, to develop this. Applied the political economy analysis is basically talking about lessons on using aid, foreign aid particularly, and the deep state to build alliances, influence policy, and make international actors more productive in many ways, more politically relevant in that sense. So a little about Alex before we start. And Alex O'Riordan and Mark Cassidy have been working on political economy analysis together for a decade. And currently they work with Adapt Consult LLC, a Washington, DC based consultancy that specializes in political economy analysis. Alex is also an associate faculty member at Royal Roads and teaches in the Human Security and Peace Building program and supervises students for us. So we are familiar with Alex, and we look forward to hearing from Mark also.
Thank you everybody for joining. I should say I'm an old friend of Ken Christie. I learned a lot from him back when I was a master's student myself, and he was a young professor at my university teaching political science. And so in many ways, his critical thinking has helped me in my career, and quite nice that we're now working together and I get to participate in the department. I currently am teaching HUM 691, most exciting course on campus, obviously. And I have great students, and I'm really pleased to be with Royal Roads. Before I start, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Mark Cassidy, who's my friend as well. When we talk about this political economy analysis, you're probably going to hear us implicitly complaining about how aid is in many ways stuck in an old way of thinking and doesn't really change. But the truth is, Mark and I have both been working in the aid business for 25 years. And the reason why we have been, well, at least the reason why I've been so involved in it is because we all know that we do not know the actual answer in this business. We're not selling McDonald's burgers. We are talking about often intractable social problems. And whilst the aid business is slow to change, it's also one of the few areas where you can work and honestly try to forge your own path and learn new things. It's not easy. You meet enormous barriers, but it is possible to do that. And it's similar to the introduction. Yeah, I'd like to just say, political economy analysis, at least in terms of how Mark and I work on it, was born out of a conversation that started 16 years ago in Bulgaria, where we were both working in Bulgaria with the Bulgarian government, and Mark was working with the labor movement. And we were deeply concerned that we were pushing technical solutions to political problems. And by that, what we mean was we were telling people, hey, we will train you on X, Y, Z, rather than saying, hey, can we make friends with you and figure out what you need? And that's the basics of it. So as this political economy analysis came to fruition, Mark and I were fortunate enough to be able to work on it. Mark, before me, he became a governance director at PACT, a very large American NGO, him and I helped draft a guideline on this, and then Mark went on to become a democracy fellow at USAID and participated in designing USAID's applied political economy analysis framework, which is essentially what Mark and I do professionally with Adapt Consulting, this little boutique consultancy firm that we have, well, Mark has, which sort of specializes on political economy analysis. So as a matter of introduction, the best way to talk about this is that what we're talking about is thinking and working politically through applied political economy analysis. And basically what that means is trying to get projects and programs to act in a more politically nuanced manner, sensitive manner, by thinking carefully about the environment. So looking at your political economy environment in an applied manner, so not just looking at the broad spectrum, but trying to understand how we fit into it and how the project activities or the resources that a donor or international actor has can be applied. The reason why this is so important is because the whole goal of the humanitarian sector and of international actors in the global world is to actually change countries' policies. I mean, if it's peace building, you're trying to convince high-level political decision makers to change how they approach conflict in order that there won't be a humanitarian crisis. Humanitarian actors are not needed. If it's public financial management, you're trying to convince governments to adopt standards so that they don't essentially waste public resources and that donors are no longer needed. And a lot of what happens in this space is approached very much through a technical lens. So let's train people, let's do some research, let's give them some capacity. But the problem with that approach is that if you really want to change policy, what you really need to do is make friends with the people you're trying to convince need to be changed. And that means identifying locals who are influential and trying to make friends with them. So before I move into our presentation, I just wanted to draw your attention to the little picture at the bottom. This is a snapshot from the USAID website. For any of you that are interested in this, I would suggest you just Google USAID PEA or Thinking and Working Politically. And there's a lot of good resources, much of them co-authored by Mark Cassidy. I'm glad to have here as on the panel. If you're interested as well, there are also, this is increasingly becoming a norm in other big international actors too. So you'll find similar resources on the World Bank sites. The EU's adopted a new manual. DFID has been a global leader in this for a long time. That's the Brits. I'm sure even Canadian CEDA has something on it. Okay, I shall now move on. So I don't know if any of you watched this really terrible movie that came out in the 90s called Mooseport. In the movie Mooseport, Gene Hackman, who's the guy on the right, plays a former president who retires to the small, idyllic Midwestern town. And Ray Romano is, the character on the left, is the owner of the local hardware store. Now it's a really small town, it's really idyllic. Gene Hackman's the big news, the ex-president that's retired. And Ray Romano is running to be mayor in this tiny one-horse town, right? Gene Hackman gets convinced to run for mayor as well. So even though he's a former president, he runs for mayor. And in the movie, there's a scene where they have a sort of town hall meeting, and they're taking questions from constituents, potential voters. And Gene Hackman one of the voters stands up and says, look, I have this problem. Ever since the stop sign was installed next to my house, every time the cars stop, people drive up and stop their cars at night, the headlights of the cars shine into my windows and wake me up. And so Gene Hackman, as the former president, stands up and says, well, my solution would be to form a committee that's representative of the city, of the town. We would take in voices from all sorts of constituencies, like private sector, And we would build a new master traffic plan, and we would resolve this issue in a responsible and efficient way. The answer doesn't really go very far. They turn to Ray Romano, who owns the hardware store, and he says, listen, I just got some blackout blinds into the hardware store. If you have time, I'll drop by tomorrow and install them on your windows. The reason why I tell you this story is that in many ways, all politics is local. Politicians have to get elected in order to be able to have power. And when it comes to the aid business, we often engage them in the role that they've been elected to, rather than understanding that the real influence they have is how they got elected in the first place, how they will be re-elected to their posts. In that, I also want to bring up another point. Especially in the aid and humanitarian business, what we often do is we treat politicians as if they're policymakers, as if they went to university, like most of you, and studied master's degrees in public policy or humanitarian affairs, that they read documents, that they're actually honestly interested in what they do. But if you really think about it, to get elected, the average politician has to design a speech and go give that speech over and over and over again to the Cub Scouts, to the knitting club, to the Catholic Church prayer ladies, to the donors, over and over again. And each time they give that speech, they have to give that speech with enthusiasm. And they have to go shake hands with people that they may not actually like. And they have to pretend to be happy, and pretend to enjoy the engagement, and pretend to value every voter, which, most people do not actually enjoy engaging with every potential voter. There have been studies done that show that sociopaths are more concentrated in professions where these sort of skills are needed. And the estimation is that whilst 4% of the general population are sociopaths, as many as 20% of politicians or corporate leaders or criminals are sociopaths as well. The reason why I bring this up is because it's really important to understand that the whole aid business hinges on the ability to influence these people. And often we think about these people very differently to how they are. Okay, so that's my first introduction. I'm going to the next slide. What happens after a politician gets elected? So once a politician gets elected, and we're talking here to the national legislature, so you become a member of parliament. Once you become a member of parliament, you really only have a very small window of opportunity. If you want to be re-elected, which is your fundamental job more than anything else is to get re-elected in 4 years or 5 years' time, depending on the theme. The first thing you can do is you can try to become a shining star. And that means pursuing the very few opportunities that there are available to you to command important portfolios. And by that, what I mean is things like Ministry of Education, where you get to make friends with the teachers who will help you get re-elected. Or Ministry of Agriculture, where you get to make friends with farmers. Or Ministry of Trade and Industry, where you get to make friends with big business. And it's very much like the game of musical chairs, where there are not enough chairs for the children at the party. So the first point after getting elected is to try to make sure you get into one of those chairs. You command one of those ministries, because if you can command one of those ministries, you get to do favors for people that will vote for you, and hopefully you get re-elected. If you're not able to get a seat in one of those chairs, the best thing you can do is not stay in parliament and do policy making. It's to go back home and start working on your re-election campaign. Because the truth is, the minute you're up in the capital, that's the minute your competition starts campaigning against you. And so this is point number 2 of political economy analysis, is understanding that politicians are not necessarily doing what they look like they're doing. The third point here is what we call bandwagoning for favors. I don't know if you remember that movie, Charlie Wilson's War. It's based on a very true story. But essentially, Charlie Wilson was a congressman in America who managed to put himself in a very influential position on the defense and appropriation committees in the state, in the legislature. But essentially what he was doing was selling his vote for favors. So sitting in parliament, selling votes for favors, using those favors to help get re-elected. And that's the business of being a politician, is getting re-elected. Okay, what does this mean for aid and humanitarian actors? So, a little history about aid. Aid before 1989 was a tool in the Cold War. By and large, it was defined by the Soviet Union and the Western alliances essentially offering gifts to countries as consolation or to buffer up support. So that's why we often saw aid in the 70s and 80s was building concert halls or building vanity projects. Donors didn't really generally even think about what sustainable development meant. It was really just about shoring up political alliances. If it was Angola, the Soviets were there, trying to make sure that Angola didn't turn into the West. And if it was apartheid South Africa, well, the Brits and the Americans were there propping it up because they didn't want it to go the other way. After 1989, the Berlin Wall fell and aid started to slump. And only after that slump did it start to need to basically justify itself again. And what happened was in the 90s, this narrative of poverty reduction came about. And aid rebranded. It made itself about poverty reduction. But it was not about poverty reduction in the first place. What it was about is essentially bandwagoning. It knew that there was a global problem, poverty, and it knew that it had the tools to sell itself as relevant to that global problem, poverty. And so aid has reconfigured itself to essentially talk about poverty reduction. At a certain point, the global community decided on the 0.7% GNI target. I don't know if you guys are aware of this. So essentially, all developed countries, especially members of the OECD's Development Assistance Committee, have committed to spending 0.7% of gross national income on aid. Just to give you an illustration of how this target was identified. This was not done by a bunch of economists who sat down and said how much aid is needed in the third world. It was not done saying how much aid can be afforded in the third world. Actually, what happened was there was a council of churches meeting, and a very popular bishop made a speech and said, if the rich world could not even give 1% of its income, then basically there was shame on the rich world for not helping the poor. And so what happened was the UN put together a commission and said, well, let's investigate the 1% target. They got lobbied by governments who said, we don't want to allocate 1%, that's a lot of money. And so a bunch of economists got involved and they argued that investments accounted for the equivalent of 0.3%. And so therefore we should drop the target to 0.7%. The 0.7% ODA target is entirely an example of politics. Back to 1989 and aid. There's a researcher that you can find much of the literature on. Dollar and Alessina, they did a lot of papers together. They did these seminal papers on looking at which countries get the most aid. And they essentially proved that the most aid, at least in terms of per capita, goes to countries where there's the best return on getting a vote in the UN. So essentially, countries that are expensive to get a vote in the UN don't get a lot of aid. But countries where you can buy a vote for a relatively low amount of money in the UN, well, they get a lot of aid. And that's part of the whole Cold War alliance. So I did a little bit of research just before having this, this workshop, and I thought I would mention this as a fact. Bangladesh gets today $19 per capita in aid. St. Kitts, the rich Caribbean country where billionaires go to float their yachts, they get $650 per capita in aid. And the Pacific island of Palau, which probably has a population of, 20,000 people, $4,712 per capita in aid. That's about buying votes. Right. So what does this mean in terms of what we actually do in aid and emergencies? So understanding that politics matters means understanding that if you want to influence decision-making, you have to understand when decision-making actually happens. So what I put up in front of you today is the standard project cycle guideline. This one's from the European Commission, but Canada has one, USAID has one. And essentially what happens is it's got a programming phase, which is basically a country strategy. Identification is where you figure out what project you want to do. Formulation is you sign a contract. If you want to influence a donor, you have to come in before the programming phase, before they've designed their country strategy, or interrupt the step between programming and formulation. So you basically make sure that the project they design responds to your inputs. If you wait until after formulation happens, you're not actually influencing, you're criticizing. And the same thing happens with governments. And we see this over and over again with the aid business, is governments formulate a policy and international actors wait until the document is released in order to criticize. That's not influence, that's criticism. So the first key point to thinking and working politically is figuring out when is the right time to speak and in which forum is the right place to speak. And in that regard, you need to understand how decision-making happens. Going back to the whole point of the bandwagon, and again, so the point of the bandwagon is you say, I am not influential enough to change the opinions of the most important people in the room. So what I'm going to do is repackage what I need so it makes sense to the most important people in the room, right? So, you know, if a donor is interested in human security and you happen to be a green energy provider, maybe you repackage green energy to be about human security. Here's a real example of this. I've prescribed this in my course, by the way, for those of you who are from the course, it's in the reading list. In Darfur, there was a small NGO providing energy efficient stoves. The Darfur crisis happened, genocide, rape, all sorts of horrible things. And a whole bunch of money came in for sexual gender-based violence. So this tiny NGO that was struggling to get money for its energy efficient stoves made the argument that if people use them in energy efficient stoves, then women wouldn't have to go to the forest to collect firewood less often and therefore be less likely to be raped. And they literally rebranded this energy efficient stove as a rape stove. Classic bandwagon. Okay, why does this matter now? And why does it matter now more than ever? The truth is that whilst we sit in developed countries and we continue to see poverty, you know, and the pictures of poverty flooding in, and see the third world as the third world, and maybe thinking that nothing's changing, the truth is it's not. The developing world is changing dramatically. A very simple example. Mark can, I'm sure, can testify to this, and maybe even Ken. 10, 15 years ago, when a donor or a visiting academic wanted to meet a minister of education in Uganda, it was not a big deal. You'd pick up the phone, you'd go. Today, that doesn't happen anymore. Donors stand in line. You know, 20 years ago, an ambassador would meet a president in an African country regularly. Nowadays, even in small African countries, ambassadors will be lucky to meet a president at the beginning and the end of the assignment. And why is that? Well, simply put, there is a very basic equation. Developed countries grow slower than developing countries. So Bangladesh grows at 6.5% a year, and aid from developed countries only grows at 2% a year. So every single year, we become 4% less relevant. And this has been going on for decades and continues on to this day. Aid money, just the bulk of money, is increasingly or decreasingly important as a share of overall expenditure. And developing countries have more to spend and therefore don't have to put up with as much demands and influence from donors. Secondly, fundamental point, revolutionaries from the bush have now become elites. So I'll take the case of South Africa. 1994, first elections. You know, the average ANC politician who was literally fighting a guerrilla warfare in the late 80s has essentially been, I mean, if they were a minister or at that level, has essentially been chaperoned around in Mercedes Benzes and lived in the best neighborhoods. And I promise you, sending their kids to better schools than you or I can afford. And they've been doing that for 2 to 3 decades now. And I'll give you a classic example of this. Last year, Tito Mboweni, who's the South African Minister of Finance, formerly head of the Reserve Bank, was in Parliament trying to explain to Parliament how he understood the issues that the country faces. So he tells a story. He says, the other day, my cell phone charger broke, so I had to go and replace the cell phone charger. So I went to the local corner shop, and I was surprised. It wasn't a South African shop. It was a Somali. This is what he says on national TV in Parliament. He says, I paid for the charger, and I didn't get a receipt. So I said to the Somali, why no receipt? He said, I don't give receipts. And so Tito Mboweni says, but as the Minister of Finance, I had to question. So I said, well, where's your registration documents? Where's your VAT registration? How are you paying your taxes? And the Somali laughed at him. And Tito Mboweni was telling Parliament as if this was a big news. Every South African knows that this is the reality in the country. But people like Tito Mboweni are no longer bushfighters. They're no longer third world poverty-stricken actors. They're elites, even if they come from some of the poorer countries in the world. And this is the problem. Point number 3, local elites themselves have become more powerful and much more agile. As I said, donors are not only waiting behind, not only less relevant, but they're waiting behind local elites, local businessmen, local church leaders. And those are the people that get the priority of meetings, and the Western alliance is structuring. And then the fourth point is that China has changed the aid landscape dramatically. And what China has done is, and there's a lot of narrative about China with its subsidized loans and all the rest of it. If you look closely at the analysis, you'll find that, I recently did this for the Philippines. The EU was looking at the cost of Chinese loans in the Philippines. The average cost of lending was 5% a year. The EU's cost of lending was 0.25% a year. That means the Chinese loans are 20 times more expensive than EU loans. And yet, when it comes to lending, the Philippines government goes to the Chinese first. The reason why they do that is not because they're not saving money. It costs them a lot of money. The reason why they're doing that is that the Chinese don't negotiate projects. They negotiate political deliverables. So they go to, Kenya, for example. They go to the Ministry of Finance and say, we know you need to fix the roads in Nairobi if you're going to get the Nairobi vote. And we will deliver it. And we will deliver it quick and efficiently. It'll cost you money, but there'll be no feasibility studies. And we're just doing what's politically important. And that's what's happening. International new emerging actors like China are able to identify political opportunities and get deals done and show that they're friends, the most powerful people in the countries, which is something that most official donors are. Another point that needs to be considered is poverty reduction itself often ensures that you are irrelevant. I'll give you an example. I was in Zambia doing a political economy analysis for UNICEF. And basically, I was talking to the Minister of Planning, and I said to her, listen, try not to look at me as a white man here. Talk to me as if I'm a Zambian. Tell me, what do you think the priorities are in terms of education in Zambia? And she says to me, look, the truth is, there's no ways we're going to get this country out of the hole it's in by giving education to poor, starving children. There are always going to be poor, starving children. It's like a sea. It never stops. Every year, there's a new wave. The only way is to build world-class universities. And she literally said to me, she said, we don't only need a Harvard in Africa, we need our own Harvard in Africa. And that's what we're going to spend our money on. UNICEF is here to help the poor, starving children. That's great. It looks good. We've got no problem with it. But the real project in this country is building these Harvards in Africa. Mark and I worked 2 years ago on a PEA on AIDS in South Africa. We had exactly the same situation. AIDS is positioned as an emergency, as a total priority, the most important health priority in the country. But if you read the ANC's, the ruling party's election manifesto, it refers to diabetes and obesity as frequently as AIDS. AIDS is just one of many diseases to be dealt with, and it's no more important than diabetes for them, even though donors call it an emergency. And so the problem is that we've invoked these sense of priorities because it raises money, but it doesn't actually resonate with the people who are making the decisions, who are thinking about their country not as third world backwaters, but as countries that have real possibilities to grow. I'll give you another example. The EU and Bangladesh. The EU and Bangladesh last year, I've been working with the EU and Bangladesh, they decided to adopt SDG 8 as a priority, decent work, basically. So I ran a round of consultations with civil society. I said, what do you think about the EU supporting decent work? Civil society was split down the middle. The one half said, hey, I don't want my child to have decent work. I want my child to have an exceptional career. What is this decent work rubbish? It means nothing. It's empty and meaningless. And then the other half of civil society was like, wait a second, there's extreme exploitation here. I mean, people are getting beaten in the factory floors. There's child labor. They're getting locked in factories and dying from pollution and fires. How can you talk about decent work? You've got to talk about combating extreme exploitation. Just another example of how we have this SDG, international priority, we take it to the ground, and then we don't understand why it is that it doesn't resonate. This is my favorite one of all, going back to the Philippines. So as you probably heard, Rodrigo Duterte is really, unlike Donald Trump, a real law and order president. His brand is justice. Now, just to make it, let me just tell you the story about Rodrigo Duterte. Rodrigo Duterte started as well, when he was a youngster, he was a bit of a gangster, and he used to go around the neighborhood pretending he was a bit of a hero. So he used to beat up bullies in the neighborhood. He wasn't bullying other people. He would literally try to take out bullies. One of his best friends tells a story of Rodrigo Duterte being 16 years old and seeing a local drug dealer in a bar and running up to the drug dealer and punching him in the face and running away at 16 years old. This guy had this fire in his belly to basically be the purveyor of justice. I'm sure he's nuts, but anyway. So Rodrigo Duterte grows up, he becomes a lawyer. He goes back to his hometown, Davao, he becomes a public defender, and he cannot get anybody prosecuted. The justice system is so screwed up that basically nothing goes forward. In fact, the government itself says that the symbol of the justice system is a turtle, that if you push it too hard, it pulls its head back inside and doesn't move. So Duterte essentially runs for mayor. Once he gets elected mayor, he gets a policeman, gets on the back of the motorbike, and he drives around Davao town, finding criminals and beating them up. And people love him. He's the most popular president the Philippines has ever had. If there's an election today, there's no ways anybody else would win. The Philippines government, despite all the noise about human rights violations, they measure justice based on the World Governance Indicators, which were produced by the World Bank. This is a real commitment. This is his personal brand, and the government has committed to measuring justice, not by internal reports, which it controls, but by international reports. If you read the statement there that I put there, that's what the EU has said is going to be the point of justice. They've literally written that they're going to be part of the justice sector because they can help with economic growth. Just missing the point that this is not about economic growth or business investment. This is about vulnerable people in Davao needing a hero. So what is the response? What Thinking and Working Politically says is that if you take some time to understand the local political context, and when we say political economy, by the way, we're not talking politics and economy. We're talking understand the economy of political decisions so that you can predict how they'll happen. In other words, understand what incentives are there for politicians to take one decision versus another. So thinking and working politically means using political economy analysis to understand the politics, developing influence strategies, treating local civil society as alliance partners, not as cheap contractors, which a lot of donors do, build relationships with elites, and bring aid administration, in other words, what the donors are doing, and foreign affairs into closer contact with each other. In other words, use the know-how that diplomats have in country to make aid more relevant and demonstrate to diplomats that aid can actually help with the broader objectives as well. I just wanted to put this poem up quickly. it's basically a Bert or Brecht poem. I mean, you guys can read it at your leisure. Essentially, it says, it ends by, it's talking about the good man, and essentially it says, the best thing to do with a good man is to put him up against a good wall and shoot him with a good gun, and then bury him with a good shovel in the good earth. The point of this poem, and the point of me raising this, is that we often think that because we're dumping money in another country, that we're actually doing the right thing. The truth is that money is a form of violence in the sense that it forces people to do things that they may not have otherwise done. And I'll give you a very simple example. A lesbian woman in South Africa a few years ago, coming out to be a donor-financed human rights workshop in a township, donned a t-shirt saying gay and proud, or gay, HIV positive and proud. And an hour later was stoned to death by a mob in the community. You know, nobody takes stock about how we change the incentives. When you go into somebody else's town and start spending money, you change the incentives for people to behave, and they can have consequences. What we're arguing for is to say, stop thinking about money as the only good, start thinking beyond money. I'm mentioning here UNDI 18. So I just did a political economy analysis last year on Malaysia in the education sector for DFID. Now, the British government has got DFID, which is the aid department. It's got Foreign Affairs, or the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And then it's got the British Council, which is essentially an education office. The PEA concludes that the only way to get the project more relevant is to start talking in Parliament. DFID says there's no way to talk about Parliament. Parliament's not interested at all. At the end of the study, I managed to interview a diplomat in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. She says to me, what are you talking about? We actually are financing an open access forum in Parliament that happens every quarter. And not only that, we're giving scholarships to young, aspiring Malaysian politicians so that we can build a relationship with them. Then I go to the British Council and I interview the British Council, and I come across a woman in the British Council, a young woman, who has essentially just come back to Malaysia. And while she was a grad student in the States, she and her boyfriend at the time decided to run a campaign, and not just a small campaign. They started a campaign to reduce the voter age from 21 to 18 years old. And with no money, no political infrastructure, they successfully got the voting age changed from 21 to 18. So this woman is sitting in the British Council office whilst DFID is saying that they don't know how to get access to Parliament. And I asked her, I said, does anybody know what you've done? She said, yeah, actually, the World Bank asks me for advice, USAID asks me for advice, but DFID has never asked her for advice. Often the resources are sitting in the very offices in which we're working. They're just not being paid attention to. Here's another example. Mark and I, one of the first political economy analysis studies we ever did was on AIDS in Namibia. We had a young field worker working for us, and very eloquent, very professional. It was only at the end of the study that we realized that her father was the first Black Anglican bishop in the country, and her mother translated the Bible into the local language. She was essentially a well-known figure in the country. Secondly, she was a model, but not a fashion model. She is essentially, if you do these like family magazines, you know, where it was mother and child, that's the sort of modeling she was doing. Now, Namibia at that time had 72 elected officials, but 55 of those officials were in the executive. In other words, they're ministers or deputy ministers or president or vice president. That means that 17 parliamentarians had to approve all the budgets and the ministry reports and would ask the parliamentary questions on the ministers when they presented. And those were the most 17 maligned politicians in the country because the 55 others all had a job in the executive. 6 of those were women. And those 6 women were taking Pilates with this young woman that was our field worker. So we're doing this whole political economy analysis about how to gain influence. And in reality, what we have is the junior field worker working on our project is running a Pilates class with the 6 most influential women in the country, and she has direct access to talk to them. So our response was basically to say, look, mobilize that network, use those access to those 6 women, and essentially put HIV/AIDS onto the agenda with every single budget. So when Minister of Transport comes and says, I want to build a road, get one of those women to say, how much money are you going to spend on AIDS? And so on and so forth. Another example just to highlight, I am getting to the end of this presentation before you fall asleep. One of the things we come across often is that sometimes a problem is not political at all, and it's just not understood. Mark and I were working on a political economy analysis in Sri Lanka. There was very slow progress on agricultural reforms. Everybody thought that the government was resisting it, and there was political resistance. We go to Parliament, we meet the Parliamentary Committee on Agriculture. They said, no, we've passed tons of bills, but the law says no bills can be officially passed until they're translated into Tamil, and there's no Tamil translators in Parliament. Tamil translator costs you $300 a month. The EU is running a $20 million program in Sri Lanka, demonstration projects and capital investment. But really, if you want to change the equation, give the Parliamentary Committee a Tamil translator. Another good point is COVID. This was probably the most depressing thing I've seen since I've started doing political economy analysis. Then the golden rule of political economy analysis is never waste a good crisis, because every crisis presents opportunities. COVID came along and the donors largely ran to try to demonstrate how they could respond in a humanitarian manner. Almost nobody took the time to say, well, this is an opportunity to influence local policy. And local policy was really important. Philippines literally authorized a stimulus 50% the size of their normal government budget. Malaysia was 100% the size of their government budget. And what those stimulus packages went on was not COVID related. The Philippines gave money to the farmers, as the farmers were the most affected in a tourism heavy economy. Bangladesh put money into the madrasas. Malaysia subsidized the internet. I mean, really, do you need to subsidize the internet during a COVID crisis? No, this is astute political actors saying, let's get together and get things done. Imagine if the donors had said, hey, wait a second, now's the opportunity to spend on healthcare or children or whatever. But no. My last slide. If there's any lesson of political economy analysis and the experiences we've had, it is that in many ways, political infrastructure, if you think about the origins of democratic governance, when elections and the election system first came into play, what would happen was rich and educated people would form parties and try to get endorsements from other rich and educated people, and then go out and try to get the vote. It was only with the arrival of the communists and the labor organizers that the working class realized that they had an opportunity to get the issues on the table by interrupting that situation. There's a fundamentally flawed approach to setting political priorities in the country club. It doesn't give voice to the voters. So people like Barack Obama built their campaign on local organizing. And what that meant was essentially going down to communities, identifying people who were concerned, getting them into youth groups, getting them to make them feel that they're not on their own, putting them into cells, basically, and getting them to go door to door, make friends, and build infrastructures. And that was all created by the labor movement and those early Communist Party thinkers in the labor movement. And that infrastructure essentially operates to a very similar extent in many countries today. If donors are going to be politically relevant, they need to start recognizing that political infrastructure and working with it. I did a political economy analysis in Jordan in the middle of the year. The donor was trying to get the government to buy into changing training qualifications for teachers. They refused to talk to the teachers union, where if you look at the most effective reforms in the education sector across the world, they're always driven by the teachers union. Most donors don't even talk to the unions as partners. Mark and I are currently working on something else, political economy analysis in Uganda. The country is 78% youth. When we started our study, pretty much every respondent told us, the youth are an irrelevant vote. They're not organized, they don't know what they're doing. And at the end of the day, the opposition will get a tiny fraction of rich, educated youth to support them. But this is not a national phenomenon. Well, if you're following the news in Uganda today, you'll see that Bobi Wine, the main opposition party, has mobilize the youth en masse, right the way to the rural areas. And that is because whilst the donors have been talking to the 80-year-old Minister of Youth Affairs as the representative of the youth, there is a whole political infrastructure that is mobilizing that we're not seeing. And that political infrastructure is through things like the boxing clubs, the scripture unions, the churches, and Makerere University, where the equivalent of us are doing master's and PhD theses, studies on poverty-related issues. And what they're doing is they're bridging the gap between young intellectuals and young urban poor, and essentially in talking to them, mobilizing them. So that brings me to the end of our presentation. Oh, I think that's absolutely the end. Yes. So that's the end of the presentation. I will, I'll leave it at that. I really appreciate the time that you've taken. As I said, if you have any technical questions or want to know any details, really, I would direct you to the USAID website. But I hope I managed to illustrate the exciting opportunities that there are in this space to really think about what change means and the role of donors and what we do. So thanks again, and have a good day.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. That was again an amazing presentation talking about these highly complex issues concerning foreign aid, elites, and the kind of disconnect between elites, as you said, this 80-year-old minister for youth. You know, maybe 80 is the new 30. You never know. In Uganda, but a really fascinating presentation. I think I'd like to turn it over quickly to Mark Cassidy. Mark is a former democracy fellow from the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, who helped craft USAID's guidance on thinking and working politically, and has huge amount of experience in this field and is working with you on political economy analysis. It'd be really good to have some of Mark's thoughts on this. I know that Mark is currently in upstate New York, watching the alarming developments in democracy in Washington, D.C. in the last week, no doubt. But it'd be wonderful if you could say a few words, Mark, on Alex's arguments presentation.
Thanks, Ken. Hi, everyone. I will, because I want to ensure you have time to ask questions, I will just keep my remarks very brief. Just to clarify, a political economy analysis, the applied version of it, is actually an analytical framework. It's a way of looking at the world. You can use it in your own hometown, or you can use it on the job when you're trying to do aid work, or for that matter, many other types of work. It's a way of understanding what are the real motivators for people who have power to make decisions or to not make decisions. It's basically taking time to carefully pay attention to why things are the way they are. Now you would say, well, don't donors do this already? I mean, they're spending millions of dollars in countries. Don't they do this already? The answer is yes and no. They do it, but because the industry is so divided by sectors and what we call stovepipes or funding conduits, there's not a whole lot of cross-sectoral programming that actually shares information across sectors to make sense of why things are the way they are. What our approach, called applied political economy analysis, does is it can work across sectors to unpack the incentives and the disincentives for change. That means basically taking a really good technical design, let's say to make drinking water more potable in a particular area, and first asking the question, well, why isn't it more potable to begin with? Why do we actually have to invest in this? Or why are children actually sitting 100 to a classroom? You know, we can all have our presumptions that we know why things are the way they are because it's a poor country, et cetera, colonialism, whatever it may be. But actually, do we know why things are the way they are? So this basically, this framework that we apply, which Alex showed you the reference, you can look into yourself to understand it a bit more, helps aid agencies to target their investments in ways that are going to hopefully have a greater return on investment. So not only in terms of like improving their outcomes in the UN, but when actually aid is being used to help alleviate poverty or help local reformers promote more like civil society or democratic reform, what's the best strategy to do it? It's not just implementing something and hoping for the best, but actually figuring out who with individuals, actors, and institutions are the ones that are either the champions or spoilers of change. So this process can, depending on the size of the problem that you're looking at, it can happen at the problem level or at the sector level or at the national or international level. But actually, it's a question you're asking. If the question is specific, you can do this pretty easily. I shouldn't say easily, but you could do it in a month or two. But if it's a larger study, let's say looking at an entire sector, it could take 6 months. Or if it's an entire country, it could take a year. The process really works very simply in the sense that we kind of read all the literature we can. We look at the social media as well at the same time to understand what people are saying about this particular question we're asking. And then we go around and talk to a lot of people. It's not just us, but we hire local people to do this work to help us interpret reality. So this could be, 30 people, 40 people, 100 people. And then we triangulate what we're finding from these interviews against the literature and the reports that we've read, and trying to make sense of reality against the program that they're trying to implement. And then we come up with some recommendations on how they should continue. They should maybe redesign the program or to tinker with the program's approach to be more effective. In other words, so that we don't waste taxpayer money. And that's essentially what we try to do in our work. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Mark. And again, it always surprised me over the years why we gave so much foreign aid to countries from the West, and yet many of these countries did not seem to improve substantially in terms of their economic development, their social development. There always seemed to be a disconnect. And I think what this applied political economy analysis is doing is showing a much more effective way to strategize and to really work with how we can make aid, how we can make funds, how donors can be more effective in actually reaching the targets, which, after 40, 50, 60 years of, giving aid and billions of dollars, how we can actually make people's lives much better by simply looking at the local context in which many of these people live. And I think there has been this huge disconnect, as you say, between elites, between the reality of what's going on in the ground. And the only way to find this out is to actually ask people in the developing world, what do you need? Instead of simply trying to impose our kind of aid solutions and throwing money at the problem, rather than actually trying to think about what's actually going on in the ground, what's the local context, etc. Because it is a hugely intricate and labyrinthal kind of way of doing things in the whole humanitarian world. I mean, the idea that you have thousands and thousands of NGOs, trying to deal with these problems, but of course all coming up against each other, always struck me as a kind of odd way to go about improving the lives of millions and millions of people. But I think what you and Alex have done is, in this kind of analysis, is come up with a new and very interesting way. And of course, this is sort of groundbreaking. This is how groundbreaking social science actually affects real problems, and the raw roads. That's what we're all about, trying to, address real solid problems on the ground with this kind of new analysis, which seems to have a lot more effect. And you know, and I know that Alex talked a lot about the political, for instance, and everyone thinks, well, the political, that's almost involves sort of bribery or corruption, or the kind of whole idea of the political action has become a kind of, has got a negative connotation in some ways. But it's maybe time to say that, you know, using politics to some extent also has very positive implications, because politics is to some extent about negotiating and, you know, looking at these realities and trying to solve them rather than backdealing, etc., and just huge corporations and huge foreign aid agencies trying to throw money to people that they're not really connected with. So I think this is really elucidated. However, we do have some questions that's come up, and I think I'd like to go over some of those questions. They were in the chat box, and I have one from Adam Bala Gay, who's, I'm not sure if I'm never sure if I'm pronouncing your name right, Adam. I hope so. But Adam says, Adam is a human security and peace building student, and he's saying there was a mention of intractable conflicts and what it means to use different multifaceted approaches to solve complex political and development issues. What do you say to critics of, say, Jeffrey Sachs' example, Dambisa Moyo, who advocate for less aid / no aid and more focus on trade and microfinancing? Alex, are you interested in answering that question?
Sure. Well, Mark, you just unmuted. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'll give it a quick shot. What I say to that question, Adam's question, is it's almost besides the point, because aid is going to flow because countries want to influence one another. So that's going to happen. The question is, how should it happen? How should that money be spent? In some cases, it should be less money. Yeah. In other cases, perhaps it should be more money. But we don't really know until we figured out what local people are actually doing already on the ground that are trying to bring change. Now, we can figure out, do we want to support those people? Do we want to support them with money, technical advice? How? But we should not be leading the solutions ourselves. We should actually be looking to what's already being done. And that, you know, then you determine how much money should go. The problem I have with these meta-analyses is that they don't apply to all situations. Alex?
Yeah, I think Mark touched on something that's really important. We talk about political economy analysis, about understanding the local context. The real point of the applied political economy analysis is trying to get the donor to understand the reach of their own, you know, how far they can actually get with the aid they've got, and to try to critically reflect on what they're bringing to the table, you know? So often what we find is that some of the biggest problems in the sector are essentially incentives created by too much aid pursuing a politically untenable goal in the local context. And then, you know, going back to things like you know, this idea of like dead aid and ending aid. I mean, people have been talking about aid ending for a long time, but if you look, it's a fairly consistent growth business. And I think the reason why is because we are in an interconnected world. And, you know, the sort of real military wonks will argue that when it comes down to it, aid is a much more influential a much more cost-effective foreign policy tool than other things like sanctions or military interventions. Thanks.
Thank you. So I have a question from Sandrine Ibakisi. I hope I'm pronouncing that also right, Sandrine. I am, and she says, I'm curious to hear more about how does the context matter in the analysis, because we have a bunch of knowledge and evidence as development solutions, but their applications often differ from one context to another, thus making the political analysis relevant for the adequate solution. So I wanted to ask, how does the context matter, and how does the differences in countries' context, how are they taken into account? So again, this is a question about context, which I know you spent quite a bit of time working on.
Yep. I'll just start, Alex, and I just say it matters very much, and that's the entire purpose of what we try to do. Basically, to get donors to pay much more attention to the local context, to read the local newspapers, to if they can't read in the local languages, to get people to help interpret that to them, to really pay attention to what's going on locally and not just be there to disperse money. But the reality is that these donors are often overwhelmed by their internal paperwork and the perverse incentives that they have inside their own agencies. It's not that they're bad people or don't care about local problems. It's just that what keeps them busy oftentimes isn't spending enough time focusing on what's happening in the country, sadly enough. Hence the reason we've kind of basically tried to fill that gap. That's why we're literally doing what we're doing.
Yeah, and I mean, to build on what Mark's saying, I'd like to circle back to the very first slide in this presentation, which is our understanding of what politicians are and what they do. When you get up close with some of these politicians, you'll realize, well, I've realized that it's very rare that a politician actually understands the nuances of the policy environment they're working in. What happens is when they're forced with a challenge, whether it's because the president wants a new direction or there's a crisis, they look to their friends for suggestions. And so when donors come with their solutions to deliver on results that they haven't checked whether they're relevant or not, they're not actually making friends with decision makers. What they're doing is they're delivering big projects that might be a friend to the people or might help the starving children, but doesn't really build that relationship with the person you need to have a relationship with to be able to be consulted when the opportunity arises. So what we typically advocate is, like, before you even think about tools, think about who your allies are, try to figure out how to make friends with them, and then redesign or even just repackage what you're doing so that it sounds relevant to what that person's trying to achieve. And if you can do that, then you'll become a trusted partner, and then they will consult you. I'll give you a very simple example. There's a project I was working on in South America where essentially it was called Eurosocial, and it was about European bureaucrats making friends with South American bureaucrats and having networks to discuss practical things like how to do crowd control and when there's big demonstrations. And so this one donor told me, he said, when Eurosocial would come to the country, their budget was like $2,000-$3,000. I mean, they were literally just paying for somebody to fly over and stay in a hotel for a couple of weeks and talk to their counterpart. And he said, when I was I think it was in Colombia, he said, when I was in Colombia, I was the chair of the donor working group on education, and we had money that was equivalent to 2% of GDP going into education. And I could never get a meeting with the Minister of Education. However, when I told the Minister of Education that the Eurosocial people were coming, he would say to me, listen, I'm a little bit busy, but why don't you come to my house and we can talk over breakfast with the kids? And the reason for that was that Eurosocial had been running that program in Colombia for 30 years. And that minister had made friends with Eurosocial back in the days when he was not a minister, when he was just a young aspiring bureaucrat. And so that's the sort of thing that we need to invest in. And that's the sort of thing we need if we want to get lasting policy.
Okay, thank you very much. I have another question from Anu Igabon. Anu was actually my student and is now an expert in gender politics in several African countries after writing a great paper for me. Anu asks, given your experience with political economy analysis and working in developing countries, what are some of the challenges you face with having political will? I want to assume that if the national government is not receiving aid or not collaborating to address a certain issue, how then do you use political economy analysis in this situation? Thank you.
Yeah, this is a good question. It's essentially a political will analysis is what we're doing. So we, that is the focus of it. And, a donor who has spent, let's say, years designing a project and then getting it funded through its bureaucracy, and then it's time to, hire a contractor or a local, some group to make it happen. And then by the time it happens, we come in and do essentially our political will analysis and tell them there's no political will. So they don't really like that often. But what we do then is say, okay, there may not be political will in what you originally thought was the problem, but we do see some indications that it exists in different places with different actors and institutions. So what we recommend is that you can still keep your goal, so you don't have to change your funding, go through the bureaucracy and change your funding. But we do suggest that you start from a different place where there is some political will, and try not to ruin it with giving them too much money, because that's another factor. Dumping too much money on someone can actually distort a problem and create perverse incentives, which sometimes the donors have, they need to spend the money in order to get money in the next year. So it's always a troubling balance. How much they listen to us, they don't always listen to us, to be very honest with you. They don't. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they say, thank you for the information, but I think we'll do things as planned 3 years ago, to be honest.
Okay, great. Thank
I mean,
you
if I could
so
just
much.
add on to what Cassidy's saying, just one small thing. Sorry to cut you off, Ken. In our business, we go to countries and we look through the lens of failure. Where's the capacity gap? Why is there no political will? Why is there institutional failure? If you start with a different question, you say, where is there evidence of major decisions happening quickly? You'll see that countries look very differently. I'll give you a very simple example. Uganda. Donors complain that the government has no political will on all sorts of things. Earlier this year, Museveni got concerned about urban crime. And one of the donors reported to me that on the Monday, he gave a speech saying, I'm going to sort this out. We're going to install closed circuit TV cameras around Kampala. And he said, by the weekend, the installations were happening. When these governments want to act, they act. So it's not about where there is no political will. The analysis is really where is there political will or political incentives, and how can you piggyback your projects on that?
Great, thank you. I have a question from Kim Lee. The presentation thus far has focused on humanitarian aid and donor influence to countries that rely on aid. How could one use the political economy analysis to address domestic issues? Yes, we can speak to the affected population, but short of a very effective movement, how do we get our government to respond to domestic proposals for change?
Well, that's a great question. And I will say that it's the same process. And you can't assume just because you are from a particular country, you understand everything that's going on in the country or even in the place where you live, until you take the time to actually look into why things are the way they are, and understand who are the major decision makers in the particular area on a particular issue. You won't know. You can have your assumptions, but until you've had numerous interviews and done a lot of reading and triangulated that information, you're just guessing, just like anyone else. Just because you're from the area, it doesn't really make that much of a difference. So it's the same methodology approach to home. The question is, you have to have someone, it's a lot of time and effort. I mean, it takes months to do this stuff properly, if not longer. So, who's going to pay to do that is the big question. So.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got another question from Adam. Adam says, what approaches can aid agencies and local institutions leverage to achieve sustainable gains in fragile states long after aid agencies have left?
I would say, this is also the purpose of applied political economy analysis. It's to invest in what is locally driven solutions. So from the very beginning, our approach is what is politically viable at a local level. So let's not say like, let's just fix the problem now, but let's support actors and institutions who are already trying to do this work, and let's get behind them and strengthen them so that when our money does dry up, they can continue without us. So that is the kind of the real purpose of this work. It's to support sustainable to us means the answer to your question. Alex, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'd like to add a little bit to that. I think if anything, it's about trying to see the world through the eyes of the leaders in that country. I mean, I remember doing some work with the EU in South Sudan, and it was a multi-donor country strategy. We're trying to basically get everybody on table to agree a country strategy from South Sudan just after independence. This was the first development strategy ever done with the European donors in South Sudan. And in the analysis, it said that 98% of the government's budget came from oil revenue. And every year, inflation was running at 16%, and oil revenue was dropping at 10% a year. So basically what it meant was that the government was looking forward at a 26% or 30% drop in budget every year for the next decade. Now, if you're in the government and you have donors saying, hey, you need to train doctors, which means I'm going to build a primary school, I'm going to build a high school, then I'm going to build a medical school, and in 20 years' time, I'm going to have a doctor. And you know that in 10 years' time, the government's going to have 20% of the resources it has today. You're not going to plan for the future. You're going to take as much money as you can and get out before the ship sinks. And that's exactly what happened in South Sudan. And we realized this as the EU. And I remember very clearly meeting the EU ambassador and presenting this to him. And he said, don't worry, the Brits have this sorted out. So I went to see the British ambassador. They said, oh, that's a real problem, but the Norwegians have it sorted out. They've got their oil for policy thing. When you see the Norwegians, they're like, no, we're not talking about that. But the Americans know the solution. And finally, got a meeting with the head of USAID, and USAID said to me, that's an interesting question, but we don't get involved in that level of policy thinking. So, in protracted emergencies, you see this stuff all the time. And in some ways, it's not so much about the politics of the country, it's about the fact that humanitarian actors just roll in often without thinking at all about the consequences. And I'll give you another example. We did a PEA on Somalia. Donors wanted to know why they're having such little traction on improving the justice system. It was only 2 days before the end of the PEA study that it suddenly dawned on me that the donor project, which was basically about improving access for women who'd been raped in Somalia to formal justice, which basically, because of the Islamic culture, it's almost nobody would ever actually publicly go to a court and pursue justice. So we're talking a very slim minority of people. The budget for that sexual and gender-based violence justice project was larger than the Ministry of Justice's entire budget. Now, you're not even talking to the people when you come along with, so much money. There was literally more money in that donor project than the Somali government had to run the prison system. I mean, very odd, but anyway, I shall move on. I hope you understand.
That's the political economy of aid, right? They've got to spend their budgets, and simply we're just trying to make it a bit more effective. But also, let's be honest, we could be a threat in the sense that we say that maybe all this money is not necessarily needed at this time. So that's not always a welcome message to be received by people who get promoted by spending their budgets.
Yes, political economy lesson number 1, don't get in the way of the money.
So one of the things that's always interested me is, coming from my perspective, I have a lot of friends in the humanitarian industry and aid industry and NGO industry. And as you know, there's literally thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of NGOs that work in the aid business and donate and spend a lot of their time trying to find funding for their projects. But it always struck me that many of my friends would have a 1-year contract with this organization or a 2-year contract, maybe at the max, and then they would have to move on. They would have to find another job. There was no job that lasted over 5 or 6 years or really gave people time to develop that kind of continuity, to get to know the really local context. They'd be sent off to some, small group of islands, like say the Marshall Islands of Indonesia or something like this, spend a year there, maybe 2 years at the most, and then move on to a project in Bosnia or move on to a project in Uganda. And I know that you, Alex, have had, kind of experience of this yourself, and probably Mark. But isn't that kind of going against the whole process, that we don't really have a deep understanding of what these local economies really need? Because people in this whole business, this humanitarian aid business, are shifted around so much. So we don't get time to establish these real institutional and people-based initiatives in a continuous sense. I mean, I always thought that was a very kind of short-sighted way of doing things.
Can't disagree with that, Ken. That is the reality. And I've always wondered why there was no kind of sustained investment in area experts as well. I mean, I heard stories about the fear of Westerners going, quote unquote, going local, being sympathizing too much with local populations and therefore not being reliable sources for. But I don't know if that's the case. It is what I kind of consider the unseriousness of our industry, and that's not the proper word, but to invest in the long term. I'm an East African specialist, so I speak Swahili, and I lived in the area for many, almost a decade, but still, that's not that long, actually, if you think about it. It's more knowledge than most, but it's not that much knowledge. So yeah, I don't have more to add to that other than to say it's a good observation.
No, I'd like to add on to that and agree with both of you. But just to add some flavor here, the reason for this goes all the way back to the ideas of diplomatic service, right? So if you go back 200 years ago, a country, I don't know, Spain would send an ambassador to Argentina or whatever. And the big fear, because there was no communications in those days, was that the ambassador would go rogue, build his own little empire. You can't pick up the phone or fly over and see him. So the Foreign Service built in these rotations, as Mark rightfully says. The whole point is to fracture your connections in the country. The whole point is to reduce the risk that you end up controlling your own country rather than the other way around. Now, take that problem and think post 9/11. I mean, Mark and I have gone to US embassies where literally the officials will say to us, listen, do not come to the embassy. It takes too long to get in. So we will meet you at a coffee shop outside the embassy. Or you'll get into the embassy and people say, I wish I could get out the embassy and come to meetings like you, but security protocols don't allow it. I worked at the EU in Ethiopia, and Ethiopia, oh my God, the government is like so anti-civil society. But I sat in the Ministry of Finance as an advisor. Anybody could walk into the government. There's no security. I mean, maybe there's today. So civil society would run the halls trying to get access to government officials. You try to get access as local civil society to the UN or any donor, not happening. You can barely even get access as a researcher because of the security situation. Secondly, the situation is made even worse by the fact that there's an underappreciation of what human resources cost. Now, I know this may sound self-serving, but the simple reality is developing countries tend not to have good human resources or have a shortage of human resources. So if, for example, you want to hire a fantastic PhD student, you're probably better off going to France and hiring a PhD in stats and bringing them out to Kenya than trying to hire a good Kenyan. And Mark and I can attest to this. We use local researchers all the time. And getting good local researchers will cost us more than often getting expatriates on the ground who are equally as good. And those human resource costs, people don't understand. I mean, we all don't understand it. We sort of think, oh, it's third world country, therefore everybody should earn nothing. But the truth is, superstars in the country, and often superstars are just having the confidence to speak to donors, being able to write in English, and being numerate. That often is, in some cases, many cases, that's enough to make you a superstar. Those people are rare resources, and they get picked up by private sector, and they get picked up by donors, and government can't afford them. So what happens is those human resources are costly, and donors don't want to spend the money on it. And so what happens is they push the budget down, so they struggle to keep good local human resources. And now what's happened is it's got to the point with some donors where so like the EU, for example, no longer contracts and no longer pays for rent or schooling costs, right? They say it's not their issue. They just pay a flat and daily consultancy rate. So it all seems very good. I'll give you a real practical example. I had a friend, he was offered a 3-year contract in Kenya, 500 euros a day, I think it was, 110,000 euros a year. And he turned the job down. I'm like, why are you turning the job down, man? 110,000 euros a year, it's enough money, you can live well. And he was like, no, I had to rent a house, it's 30,000 a year. The International School of Kenya now costs $30,000 per kid per year. So 2 kids, that's another 50,000 gone, flights, tickets, and all the rest of it. And he said, basically, my wife's, she was a teacher in England. I mean, basically it was more affordable for him to stay at home and not work and just have his wife working. So, what's happening is you're seeing a hollowing out of human resources in this sector. Essentially, the internationals that are employed tend to be young, early professionals or retired elderly professionals. And the people who sit in post and make those relationships don't exist anymore. And if you really want to know, I mean, again, we have models for how this works. The old Jesuit priests, those were the networks, and still today, some of the networks that we rely on when we do our political economy analysis. Those Jesuit priests would go and sit in communities, and it would take them 10 years to get the confidence of the local chiefs and local leaders. It'll take them 20 years to become influential, and it'll take them 30 years to figure out what needs to be done. And sadly, the aid business doesn't have that, or at least unless it starts buying it in. And then finally, there is another fundamental problem that I want to raise, and that is our business doesn't like success. It really doesn't. And I know it sounds crazy, but it's much easier to, if you've got a project that's been successful, the typical donor response will be oh, it's successful, hand it over to government, let them finance it. If you want to get your project extended and your contract extended, you actually need a moderately successful project that fails, because then the donor narrative is, hey, we spent all this money, we learned a lesson, now let's go to round 2. But what happens is it means that there's an inherent incentive to put money into crappy projects, which then turns into undermining your influence in the first place. So anyway.
Okay, thank you. I've got one final question, and I'm sorry to Anu and Sandrine, because you've already had a couple of questions here. But I have one question from someone who hasn't asked a question, from Shanti Baker. And she is asking, female genital mutilation is a global problem. The USA has just signed into federal law that it is illegal for anyone to perform FGM on anyone in the United States. Could humanitarian aid in the country be connected to stopping this procedure on girls? So I'm guessing they're looking at, what does the aid come with, strings attached, the human rights application.
I'm happy to take that. There's around 2003, was 2003? No, sorry, 2013. Donors there were these. What happened was for a long time there were these aid darling countries where aid was supposed to have worked really well. Talking Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Malawi, and Mozambique. And around 2012, 2013, donors, particularly European donors, started getting real pressure on the press because of reports of corruption. And so 2012, 2013, en masse, budget support was cancelled in Malawi, Mozambique, Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya, and Ethiopia for that matter. In all of those countries, the thinking was, we will cancel the budget support and then show to the government we're serious, and then they'll pay more attention. It's never recovered. Government talks less to the donors and has less respect for the donors and is not paying attention in a way that they used to. And I hate budget support, by the way, so I'm not trying to advocate budget support. But the lesson is if you want to influence real lasting change, you have to make friendships and be around for when there is an opportunity to make the change. And then you can mobilize and get the change done. The problem is we think we can crack the whip, but nobody is going to choose something that will, no politician is going to choose something that will potentially end their political career over the possibility of upsetting a donor. They would rather upset a donor. In fact, it's even easier to get re-elected by upsetting a donor because you just run the national line. This is what Duterte does all the time. And Mugabe used to do. Hey, look, the donors are bullying us and telling us what to do. And it's very easy to distort FGM into something else, like, oh, they're trying to destroy local culture. So my answer is that unless you actually have the power to threaten a country, the best option is start investing in relationships, start investing in political intelligence, and make sure you understand where your opportunities are to make the change, and then mobilize to do it when it's opportune. But recognize that you have to be there, and you cannot essentially threaten or hope that things are going to happen on your timetable.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thanks so much. And thanks to you and Mark. And, I have to say that we're grateful for you sharing your knowledge, your ideas, your incredible expertise on this. And, hopefully we can change, and you can change the world of humanitarianism by making things a lot more effective, by improving people's lives, which is what it's all about after all, rather than getting caught up in these horrible bureaucratic webs and labyrinths of aid, which seems to go nowhere and doesn't do very much. Hopefully we can, or you guys can bring this argument to people and really make it work, because it would be transformational in terms of humanitarianism and how people are affected by it. So it's wonderful. I don't know if Selena wants to say anything at the end, but I'd like to also thank Selena, because she does these incredible hostings of these webinars. She puts it all together. She's really responsible for getting people together, and I couldn't do this without you, Selena, and your team, obviously. So a big thank you to you. You've always got a great smile on your face as well, which is very cheerful.
Thanks so much, Ken. And yes, to Mark, to Alex for being here. And without you, this session wouldn't happen. So thank you so much. And as well to everyone who signed on to listen and who registered and will receive a recording of our session. I'd like to share as well the questions that were posed in our chat box, whether we had time to answer them or they're pending for a next session. They inform the types of sessions we'll be able to host moving forward. So to all of you, a big thank you. And again, a thank you to the Human Security and Peacebuilding Programs for sponsoring today's session. So if you have any questions about the programs themselves, feel free to connect at learn.more@royalroads.ca. And that's it for me. So back to you, Ken.
And if people want to send me an email about the program and about how to apply, or information, if you're interested in doing a master's program or a diploma in human security and peace building, we have lots of information for you. And if you don't actually have to come to campus anymore now that we have COVID-19 as well, so you can do it from the comfort of your own home. But it's a great program, and I'm sure the students would really agree. We have fantastic students, and they're all working in, most of them are working in the humanitarian aid field, and having fantastic careers. And it's always a pleasure to work with great people, intellectuals like Alex and Mark, and disseminate this kind of knowledge, because it's not just about knowledge, it's about how we change things. And Royal Roads is also about, it's not just about getting your degree and having that. And that was a great time I spent at university. It's about how do I go on and actually change things for the better. How do I make people's lives better? And that's what we're all about in human security and peace building, even though that might sound a bit naive, but we have to be optimistic constantly. Thank you. And again, thank you, Selena. And I know your other team was there. Karen was there. And is there anyone else you want to mention? Thank for the.
Karen was,
Karen,
yes, such a great partner in putting this together. So big thank you to Karen, who I believe is online as well.
Thank you, Karen. I know you always seem to work in the background, but you're very prominent. Okay.
With that, we will pause our recording for today. Thank you all. We hope you have a great rest of your morning, afternoon, evening, depending on when and where you're joining us from and when you're watching this recording as well.